Hello, we are going to be taking a statistical look at the India market. Coming up, we will look at the volume, value and trip characteristics of travel from India. We will look at demographics. We will talk about economics. We will cover connectivity of India to Europe, and we'll speak a little bit about motivations and perceptions. So we'll begin by thinking about volume, value, and trip characteristics. Let's take a look at how much those from India spend on international travel. Here we're using data from the UNWTO, and the figures have been converted into billions of US dollars. It shows how much is spent on outbound travel, excluding transport fares, each year from 1995 through to the provisional figures for 2024. And we can certainly see that those in India have been spending increasing amounts on international travel. Now in 2023, India was the world's 10th most valuable source market according to UNWTO stats. And once we get the full global 2024 data, which should be fairly soon, I'm really very confident that India will have moved up at least one, if not a couple more places. What about outbound departures by Indian nationals? Well, here we're going to be using data from the Indian Ministry of Tourism, who provide a wonderful compendium of tourism statistics. The most recent folio data is, however, for 2023, but nonetheless, it gives us a really good insight into travel by those who reside in India. So this chart is looking at the top destinations that Indian nationals have travelled to in 2023. And we can see really clearly that the United Arab Emirates is way out in the lead, followed by Saudi Arabia, then the USA, Thailand, Singapore, then the United Kingdom, with the UK being the only European destination that features across this top 10. Now, with close to 28 million departures in 2023, the annual tally was twice that which it had been back in 2011, which in a sense just corresponds with those expenditure data that we looked at previously, demonstrating that as a source market, India is definitely on an upward curve for international tourism. What about visits to Europe? Well, in this instance, I'm using data published by the European Travel Commission, but it's actually based on analysis by Tourism Economics. What does it show? Well, the leftmost bar is telling us that in 2019, there were an estimated 3.9 million visits from India to Europe. Then the middle bar, that's the estimate for last year, and we can see it's about 3.6 million is the estimate. And then perhaps the big insight from this chart is just how rapidly this market is forecast by Tourism Economics to grow by 2029, by which time it is reckoned there will be about 5.3 million trips from India to Europe. And roughly 15% of outbound travel from India is destined for Europe. Because as we saw earlier, many of those travelling outbound from India are going to places across the Middle East or Asia or indeed parts of North America. Now let's drill into outbound departures from India by Indian nationals to Europe back in 2023. So we've already seen that figure up at the top for the United Kingdom because that featured in that top 10. However, what I've done here is compiled the stats for each of the other major European destinations for those from India. And we can see that it's Germany in second spot, then France, Italy, Switzerland, Netherlands, Ireland, and Spain. But perhaps the key insight here is just how far ahead the United Kingdom is compared with any other destination within Europe. But it's worth saying that many of those who are travelling to certainly perhaps mainland Europe will be on a multi-country trip. So this is the country from which the Indian was departing to, but that doesn't mean to say they spent their entirety of their time in Europe just in that single country. Now let's look at the seasonality of outbound departures by Indian nationals to Western Europe. What do we see? Well, we see that Indians are travelling to Western Europe right across the year, but we can also note that it is that April to June and the July to September chunks of this pie chart that are slightly larger than those in the earlier months of the year and the back 3 months of the year. Now, May and June are particularly popular for outbound travel from India. Why? Well, because that is when most of the Indian schools are on holiday. And as we'll see as we go through this presentation, that travel by younger Indians is really very important. What can we say about the purpose of outbound departures to Western Europe by Indian nationals? Well, again, we're using the Ministry of Tourism data, and we get a good insight here that a big chunk of our pie here, 40%, is leisure, holiday and recreation. Almost as big a chunk, 39%, that's how the Ministry of Tourism refer to Indian diaspora travel, effectively what we would call VFR travel. Notice, however, on this chart that the education chunk, that's purple, 7%. All right, a relatively small chunk, but somewhat larger than we see from many markets. And it's worth noting that in the EU in 2023, 5% of tertiary education students from abroad came from India, while 107,480 Indian students enrolled at UK higher education establishments in the academic year 2023-2024. What about trip duration of those travelling from India to Western Europe? Well, we can spot here that there's no information for a sizable 1/3 of the market, but for those where there is information, what we can definitely glean is that travellers from India to Western Europe tend to have quite a long length of stay, with 31% being in the grey zone of a trip that's lasting more than a month, and 17% lasting 1 to 2 weeks in the purple zone. Here I'm using data from Visit Britain because one of the questions that the Tourist Board has sponsored on the UK's International Passenger Survey has asked, well, who are you travelling with on your trip to Britain? And these are the results for those who are travelling to Britain from India. And we can see that a good proportion said that they were travelling on their own. Some of those, of course, may have been the students that we've spoken about. Spouse and partner, often travelling with a spouse and partner as a companion. But notice there's quite a few travelling with children of different age groups and also with adult family members. But what we can see from these figures and take note of is the fact that compared with the average market for inbound tourism to Britain, at least, those visiting from India are much more likely to be travelling with children and with adult family members, and are somewhat less likely than others to be travelling with adult friends. In this section, we're going to be talking about the importance of demographics and how it influences and plays a role in outbound travel. Let's look at the population of India. Here we're using United Nations estimates from the year 2000 and through to 2050 based on their forecasts. And what we can definitely see from this chart is that the line is trending upwards pretty much throughout that half-century period. And India has, in the past few years, become the world's most populous country with about 1.4 billion people. And its population is currently expanding by around 13 million per annum. It really is worth pausing and thinking about that. That's actually more than the population of very many countries across Europe. So that's growth each year at the present time in India's population of 13 million. Now, we spoke earlier about almost 2/5 of outbound travel from India being related to the Indian diaspora. And here I'm using data from the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. And this really paints a picture of, well, where do those with a connection to India live around the world? So each of these bars has two colours. The red chunk of the bar, those are non-resident Indians. What does that mean? Well, it means that they are an Indian national. However, they are, for either work or other reasons, living temporarily in the country that's labelled across the horizontal axis. Then the blue chunk of the bar, those are what are referred to as persons of Indian origin. So they are not an Indian passport holder or Indian citizen. However, they do have Indian heritage. From this chart, we can spot that 3 of the bars are pretty much overwhelmingly red in nature. That means they are Indian citizens who are temporarily living in those countries. And those are countries within the Middle East, so the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. Whereas some of the other countries, such as Myanmar and Sri Lanka, are overwhelmingly blue. And what we can also spot is that the outside of Asia and the Middle East, we've got a few countries there, particularly the USA. That is where we'll find the world's largest Indian diaspora. But we can also spot on this chart that we have got the United Kingdom about 2/3 of the way along with a sizable number. We can drill into that data a little bit more and take out the UK and add onto our chart other countries across Europe, which is what I've done here. And once again, what we see is just how dominant the UK is in terms of the Indian diaspora in Europe. We've got Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and France in the top 5, but frankly, it really is a story of the UK dominating in this regard. Now let's go back to the population of India itself, and what we're looking at here is the distribution of population by age group. What do we see? Well, we see that only 2% are in that grey zone of being aged 75 plus. Whereas if we look at the red and the blue zone, what we discover is that half of the population of India is currently aged 29 or younger. And by contrast, only around 30% of those who live in Western Europe are aged 0 to 29. So this is really telling us that India's population is exceptionally young compared to Western Europe and indeed parts of Eastern Asia and North America. Let's go back to our Ministry of Tourism stats. And here we're looking at the age mix of outbound departures by Indian nationals to Western Europe. The age cohorts don't exactly correspond with the preceding chart, but what do we see? Well, we see that the biggest chunk of this pie is the yellow zone. Almost a third, 32% of those who travelled outbound as an Indian national to Western Europe are aged 25 to 34. And we've got 12% aged 15 to 24 in the younger group, just below that cohort. And then in this slightly older group, another 22% who are aged 35 to 44. So predominantly, the Indian population is young, and predominantly travel by Indians to Western Europe are by young folks. We can also see from the stats that 58% of those who travel from India to Western Europe are male, while 42% are female, so somewhat more male than female in nature. In this section, we're going to look at the importance of economics and how it impacts outbound travel. We'll begin by looking at GDP per capita in India using IMF data all the way back to 1980 with forecasts through to the year 2030. And now this data is at what is called constant prices, so it adjusts for inflation, but it's also using what is termed purchasing power parity and the international dollar. And the reason that the IMF do that is to try and make data across countries somewhat more comparable, because clearly it's a lot cheaper to live in some places than it is in others. So we're trying to get more of an understanding, if you like, of how does this stack up. What's the trend? Well, we can see that the trend for the first 20, 30 or so years was gradual increases in GDP per capita in India, then starting to pick up during the 20-teens, bit of a dip during the pandemic, but then much more substantial growth in the past few years, with that acceleration expected to continue through to 2030. However, what we can see is that by Western standards, this GDP per capita is still relatively low in India. And of course, there are very many in India who are getting by on a very, very small amount of income. However, as we've seen with a population of 1.4 billion, there's quite a spectrum. And Capgemini estimate that in 2024 in India, there were around 378,810 high net worth individuals. And those are folks who have a disposable amount of wealth in excess of $1 million US, while Knight Frank estimate there to have been 85,698 whose wealth exceeded $10 million US last year. So yes, while very many in India have insufficient income to consider international travel as a realistic prospect, there is a growing middle class, but there is also a growing number of folks who have a very high amount of income, so certainly potentially within that luxury segment for foreign travel. Another important way to think about India's economy is to look at, well, what share of global GDP does the country account for? And again here, we're looking at half a century's worth of data, 1980 through to forecasts up to 2030 from the IMF. And again, this is based on what is termed purchasing power parity. So we can see a gentle upward trend in the amount of the world's economy accounted for by India, really starting to accelerate in the past few years. And if these forecasts are correct, it won't be many more years before 1/10 of the global economy is accounted for by India. Let's look at recent and forecast economic growth. So we're looking at 2023 through to 2026. And again, these are forecasts made by IMF in July of this year. And this would be the envy of many countries across Europe and North America, with 9% growth in 2023 and then 6+% growth in each of the next 3 years. It is, however, worth noting that the economic outlook is more uncertain than usual for India, and indeed just about everywhere else around the world at the present time, due to what the US is doing with regard to tariffs. But on the upside, India has recently secured a trade deal with the US and looks set to be on course to have done so with the EU in the months ahead, which may drive up the amount of trade between India and the UK and Europe, and trade leads, of course, to travel. How confident are consumers in India? Well, this is looking at trends each month since 2013, and we can see that by and large, consumer confidence in India has certainly recovered from the dips that we saw during the pandemic and again in 2022, but it's not quite got back to where it was in 2019. One of the economic factors that certainly impacts outbound travel, the destinations that people choose to go to and how much they spend once they've arrived, is the exchange rate. What I'm showing you here is the cost of buying €1 for those who are traveling from India. over the period from 2005. Yes, there are ups and downs, but what we can see, were we to place a ruler along this chart, is that by and large we have seen an increase in cost of how much it is to buy a euro for those travelling from India, with a particular uptick in the past 3 or 4 months. So that is a challenge as it's becoming more expensive for those from India to buy European currency. In this section, we're going to talk about connectivity and how important it is for travel from India to Europe. Let's have a few connectivity insights. Now, India, in spatial terms, is the world's 7th largest country. As such, we must take account of the fact that flying time from the north of India to Europe is around 4 hours less than from the south of India to Europe. Now, India accounts for 17.8% of the world's population, but only 4.2% of global air passengers, which really demonstrates just how few, relatively speaking, of those in India are able to enjoy aviation at the present time. Now, IATA forecast 5.6% average annual growth in air passengers to, from, and within India across the next 20 years, so sustained annual growth of more than 5.5%. There are 16 airlines operating direct flights from India to Europe at present, and we've recently seen Indigo launching non-stop flights from Mumbai to Manchester and Amsterdam, and very recently it has mooted the idea of flying from the end of October this year into Heathrow. We think from Delhi, but it's not yet confirmed. At present, Air India, Lufthansa and British Airways are the main carriers in terms of seat capacity, providing direct access from India to Europe. And there are at present 41 routes operating between India and Europe. Let's look at seat capacity out of India in July of this year by destination nation. We find that the UAE is way out in the lead, ahead of Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Qatar, Malaysia, and then I've shown in blue the UK, because that is the only European destination that features within this top 10. Now, it's worth noting that the 3 big Middle Eastern carriers of Emirates, Etihad and Qatar each serve between 9 and a dozen airports across India and a myriad of European airports. So whilst on the previous slide I spoke about direct flights from India to Europe, it's worth noting the ease with which many in India can reach Europe by transiting through one of the hubs across the Middle East. Let's look at seat capacity ex-India in July of this year in terms of the top routes. We've got Mumbai to Dubai and Delhi to Dubai at the top, and then again we've got 2 blue lines representing European routes on our chart, Delhi to London Heathrow and also Mumbai to London Heathrow. Another aspect of connectivity is of course bureaucracy, so let's have a few words about visas. Now, Indian nationals require a visa to visit the Schengen area, with the cost set at €90, or if you happen to be a child aged 6 to 12, €45, and the visa allowing for stays of up to 90 days within a rolling 180-day period. Indian nationals require a visa also to visit the UK, and should they wish to buy one, it will cost for a 6-month visa £127 sterling, which at today's exchange rates is roughly €146. Were an Indian national wishing to travel just to Ireland, again they would need a visa, and the cost for a single entry visa into the Republic of Ireland, that is €60. So certainly we can see that that is an element of how much it's going to cost travellers from India coming to Europe. In this section, we're going to talk about motivations and preferences. Let's begin with some data from a study undertaken by Visit Britain a few years ago, which asked folks right around the world, including in India, and that's the market we're going to look at, a whole host of questions. And one of them was thinking about the considerations that are seen as extremely important when deciding on a destination. Now, it's worth noting that those from India have a tendency to agree with lots of statements in research, whereas some other nationalities perhaps are less likely to agree. So we have to keep that in mind and perhaps not take the percentages as absolutes, but to look at the ordering. So what are the sorts of factors that are considered as being extremely important? Well, is a welcoming place to visit. That matters to those thinking about traveling somewhere from India. Offers good value for money. We've talked about exchange rates and we've talked about wealth. There is beautiful coast and countryside to explore. I can roam around visiting many types of places. It's good for relaxing, resting and recharging. So we've got lots of emotional stuff going on here in terms of what matters, but also some practical things such as how much it's going to cost, but a range of factors influencing Indians' choice of where they're going to go. The same research also asked about different types of activity or experience that you can have on a short break or a holiday. And these percentages are showing us the proportion of those in India who said they had a high interest in the activity. So visiting famous or iconic tourist attractions really up at the top of the list, along with experiencing coastal places and scenery, enjoying fine dining, exploring history and heritage, local food and drink. So what we often find in this sort of research is that heritage matters, culinary things matter, landscape matters. Those are the sorts of experiences that visitors from India are definitely keen on having. Notice over on the right hand side of this graphic, some of those things to do with visiting distilleries, wineries, rather lower than we see from a number of potential source markets for Europe. What are the main sources of inspiration for a holiday for those from India? Well, we can see that social media, whether that's things like travel bloggers or influencers, or whether it's more to do with advice from friends and family, those are often cited as being very important ways of getting inspiration for a holiday. But also travel websites, and we've got national tourist boards and recommendations, of course, from friends and family. So a range of online and offline sources are impacting the choices that those from India make. So we saw that social media was important. Here I'm using data from Mountwater on the percentage of internet users aged 16 plus who use different social media platforms each month in India. And some of these are actually being used primarily for communication, but we've got WhatsApp up at the top, then Instagram, very important of course for imagery and for destinations, Facebook, Telegram. What you will spot here is the absence of TikTok, and that's because TikTok is in fact banned in India. So that is not a way of influencing potential travellers from that particular source market. Now let's go back to that Visit Britain research and ask how those from India booked elements of their most recent trip. And what we find is that 51% said I booked all key elements of my trip in one package, with a third saying I booked some but not all elements together. And it's certainly worth taking note of the fact that those from India were more likely than any other of the almost 24 markets that this research covered to say that they booked all key elements of their trip as one package. So certainly that is core to travel outbound from India. For those who said they booked a package, well, let's look at how they said they booked it. The longest bar on this chart with 23% are those who said online only, a travel agent or tour operator. But just above that with 19%, we've got an online marketplace, so a website or app that connects the traveler with accommodation and experience providers. But also notice 18% said a travel agent who offers advice support through personal interactions, such as a high street shop. So yes, Indians certainly are comfortable with being online, but there's still a sizable proportion who are perhaps using those more bricks and mortar approaches to book some of their trips. That brings us to an end of this presentation, but it's worth me reminding you that there is an awful lot of insights on markets, on segments, on policy, and much more beside that you can find on the ETOA Insight Hub. Thank you very much.